Hello. This presentation focuses on the differences between inductive, deductive and abductive research. This is a key decision that you need to make in your research approach section of your dissertation. So typically we might explain which approach we're adopting, whether it is inductive, deductive or abductive, and explain why it's relevant to our study and what it actually implies. So I've just got a slide each one of these to try to explain what they actually mean. So the first one, as you can see here, is inductive research. Now, inductive research, as it says at the bullet point at the bottom, tends to be about finding out and theory generation. So typically in inductive research, we start with observations. We actually go and find things out. So we might collect some data and then we'd do some analysis, and from that we'd build an explanation or possibly theory. Don't get too bogged down in your dissertations about generating theory, but you should be able to build some kind of explanation. And this is an inductive process. It's very typical with qualitative research, although you can also do it quantitatively, and I do a lot of quantitative research which is inductive, but it's most often associated with qualitative research and usually associated with topics where there isn't a lot of existing knowledge, so it's a new and emerging area. So for an example, a few years ago, and actually probably before a time than many of you can remember, when social media first became really popular, and particularly when it moved on to smartphones and social media platforms really took off at that stage, we didn't actually really understand a lot about social media usage and what implications it would have, for instance, for brands, for tourism, so it became apparent pretty quickly that it was going to be quite significant. But at that stage, there was a lot of inductive research in order to actually understand what was happening and actually try to develop explanations and theory related to that. So then we'll look at deductive research. Now, deductive research is kind of the opposite way round, sort of. So you usually begin with an explanation or theory, and you might think, oh, where does that come from? But that would typically come from what we already know in the literature. So there might be existing theory or an existing explanation which we think is relevant to our study. We will then go and make observations. So we'll collect some data which is basically there to sort of test out that explanation or theory, and then we will undertake analysis of that data and decide whether that theory applies or not in that particular context. So as it says in the bullets there, you begin at the explanation. You make observations, you gather data, typically to test a hypothesis. So it's about testing out models and ideas. Now, this kind of research is very common, I find, in students' dissertations. It's probably more common than inductive research, although sometimes students say they're doing inductive research, but actually they're really doing deductive research, because there is actually an awful lot already written on many of the topic areas that you'll be interested in. And so there's often theory that you can draw on from either the area you're already working in or related fields. So, for example, a classic thing would be studies to do with motivations. So, for example, if you look at the tourism studies from the 1970s that began to map out motivations for undertaking holidays, they drew on explanations and theory that existed for motivations in other aspects of life. So a lot of the early research on motivations focused on, motivations for life in general or motivations for work. And what the tourism researchers did was they drew on that theory, they used that, they made observations, undertook analysis, and then, were able to test out hypotheses and then, actually reconfigure some of that theory, to show that it was or wasn't relevant in a tourism context. So it's quite an important way of doing research, and we can often find theory in related areas to enable us to do this sort of research. So there's an awful lot of consumer behaviour theory out there that can be relevant, that hasn't been, for instance, applied in an event management context, and that's what we might draw on here. Now, a third way, which didn't used to be talked about that much and has probably emerged as an idea more recently, and also is quite typical of what a lot of students actually do, is what's called abductive research. Now, abductive research starts with a surprising fact and then looks for some kind of plausible theory to explain that fact. Now, I can give you an example of a student project that did this kind of approach. And it was a student looking at the hospitality sector, and she was interested in workplace conflict. Now, there's quite a lot known about workplace conflict. It's quite a common problem. But her surprising fact was actually there was little or nothing written about how you would actually manage this workplace conflict, especially in a service sector like hospitality. She could find some in much more sort of manufacturing type sectors, but nothing related to hospitality. So actually, she was really surprised about that. She actually was like, okay, so no one's actually looked at how you manage workplace conflict within the hospitality sector. So that was her surprising fact. She then went and looked at the plausible theory. So there's quite a lot of theory about workplace conflict, and there is some theory in other industrial sectors about managing that conflict. And so she drew on that, and then she went out and made her observations, and she did interviews of people who worked in the hospitality sector, followed that with some data analysis, and then she looked at how that theory might apply, a modified theory, in relation to the hospitality sector. So what we often talk about with abductive research is it kind of goes from theory to data to theory, and sometimes goes back and forth more than once. So you might go back and forth 2 or 3 times, looking at different kinds of theory and trying to work out what fits well in a particular context. So it's something that students often do, although I wouldn't go, you haven't got scope in a dissertation to keep going back and forth to from data to theory on multiple occasions. If you want to read more about this, the Saunders book that I recommend on your reading list is very good on this, and you'll almost certainly need to do a bit of reading to get your head around these particular concepts.